the first 5,000 years. And David Harvey, author of our new book, Rebel Cities, which we're launching today. And I just really want to say that first I was really proud to publish Rebel Cities and to co-host this event tonight. We, Verso, have been around for like 40-some years and have been talking about revolution for about that long, which is much longer than my own lifespan. And so it's really exciting to see revolution actually happen this year. And one thing that we sort of like to tell people about Rebel Cities is that we had been begging David Harvey for a book on urban revolt, an urban manifesto for years. And he finally came to us with Rebel Cities. And then just before we were about to go to press with the book, the revolution happened, and right in our own backyard. So I think David was in Chile at the time, marching in the streets of Santiago with Chile's student revolutionaries, for real, I think. And somehow he still found time to draft us a piece on OWS, which was happening at the time. And that, we got it, we edited it really, really quickly, and, sent the book to press. And that's the final chapter of the book. And I don't really know the publishing history of Debt, David Graeber's book, but I imagine his publishers, Melville House, maybe sort of had similar feelings after working on this gigantic, impressively thorough book for a really long time, only to find that debt had become probably one of the most salient concepts or issues of our current political debate. Student debt, mortgage debt, federal debt, and austerity. So let me introduce our guests. David Graeber is an anthropologist at Goldsmiths, University of London, and a longtime anarchist activist. In just 2011, he was at the London tuition protests and, of course, in New York at the birth of Occupy, and many consider him one of the leading thinkers behind Occupy. I don't know if you like people saying that about you, but too late. David Harvey teaches here at the CUNY Grad Center and is the author of many books, including Social Justice in the City, The Limits to Capital, A Brief History of Neoliberalism, Spaces of Global Capitalism, and A Companion to Marxist Capital. And of course, he's long been associated with the Right to the City movement, and many consider him one of the leading contemporary thinkers behind Right to the City. So before we begin, I just want to thank our friends at Melville House for their help in organizing this event and also manning the door, to Haymarket for selling books for us here tonight, and to Padmini and the Center for Place, Culture, and Politics for hosting us. The Center is an interdisciplinary forum that supports radical scholarship and activism here at the CUNY Grad Center, and also hosts numerous public events and lectures around themes like uprisings, which was the theme for 2012. So please check them out, join their mailing list. They put on really wonderful talks, ranging from people like Arundhati Roy to Christian Parenti. And just one more thing before we start the show. Tomorrow night, Ross Perlin, author of Internation, will be here. He is one fan. Will be here at the Grad Center in conversation with Stanley Aronowitz to launch the paperback edition of the book. And, also thanks to our wonderful intern, Mike Bacall. This is his last week. He's been wonderful. We'll be sad to miss him. We'll be sad to see him go and miss him. And on Friday, we're launching our other book, It Started in Wisconsin, Dispatches from the Front Lines of the New Labor Protest. And that's going to be at the Brecht Forum with editor Paul Buell and the new art and illustration collective, Occupy Comics. We also have a bunch of other events this week, or in this next 2 weeks, with Mary Kay Wilmers, longtime editor of London Review of Books, Louis Lapham of Lapham's Quarterly, with A.L. Weissman, and with the editors of Occupy, Scenes from Occupied America. So you can get more info at the Haymarket book table outside later. Also, the question period later, we've been handing out little index cards. So if you guys have a question for either of the Davids, please write it out and we'll collect them after the talk and pass it on to them. So let's start the show. David Harvey.
Okay. Let me first correct the record. I've been on sabbatical all this year, and I left in mid-September, and about a week or so after I left, they went and occupied Wall Street. I was on sabbatical, not in the streets of Chile. I was living out in the countryside, about 500 kilometers south of Buenos Aires, 10 miles from the nearest Wi-Fi cafe, and feeding chickens and doing things like that. And my single observation from the whole year would be this, that the idiocy of rural life is really so much more preferable than the idiocy of American political life. Conversations with chickens make a lot of sense. Conversations with the Republican establishment and all the rest of it make no sense whatsoever. And we seem to be in this senseless world. And I hope that tonight we can try and recoup some sense in terms of political strategies and political thinking around how an oppositional movement, an anti-capitalist movement, can be created and how it can begin to flourish. The book was written using, as often happens, various articles and putting them together and then reshaping some of them and rethinking some of them. But I think the key chapter, which I was trying to add on and expand upon at the end, is the idea of reclaiming the city for anti-capitalist struggle. And for a long time now, I've been, of course, working on the whole kind of question of urbanization and the struggles that occur around urbanization. And on the left, in general, this tends to have been rendered rather peripheral from our thinking. I guess one of the legacies of Marx and Marxism is to start to think about the proletariat as the major agency of change, major agent of historical transformation. And the proletariat is largely looked upon as being the industrial proletariat, with maybe agricultural and mining and so on mixed in. But it's been a very work-based kind of idea, when, of course, there are a lot of struggles over urban life and urban living. And very frequently they're called sort of urban social movements, and they're about rights, they're not about, class. And so there's a tendency to have a sort of schism between thinking about what's going on in the city and what's going on in terms of the organization of a labor force in struggle with capital. And it's always seemed to me that we should pay much more attention to the question of who produces and reproduces urban life. And if we change the idea of production away from the production of widgets in a factory, or the production of automobiles, or the production of coal, or something like that, to the question of who produces the city and who reproduces the city, who produces spatial organization, then you start to get a very different definition of who is the proletariat and what that proletariat is about. And for me, of course, having done a great deal of work on what happened in Second Empire Paris and what produced the Paris Commune, it was pretty clear to me that it was not an industrial proletariat that produced the Commune. Certainly there were artisans heavily involved, but many of the people who were involved were the stonemasons, the builders, and many other people who were actually supporting urban life. And to claim that the commune, Paris Commune, was a uniquely proletarian event seemed to me to suggest that we needed a much broader definition, even back then, of who was or was not the proletariat. So that is, if you like, one of the first ideas that seemed to me very important. But when you took that and you started to look at the whole history of urban-based struggles, you see a whole series of urban-based revolts, revolutions, rebellions, of which the Paris Commune was just one. And all of them had, I think, a certain significance historically in terms of what happened and why. In this country, for example, there was the Seattle General Strike of 1919 that most people don't talk about, but it was an urban event. And it was about the city. Cordoba in 1969. There was the Shanghai Commune back in the 20s and again in the 60s. There have been events, the Petrograd Soviet. I mean, you just sort of go on. And beyond that, what you see is it's not only single cities that are involved, but frequently whole networks of cities become involved. If you look back at the revolutions of 1848, what you would see, it wasn't only Paris, it was Frankfurt, it was Milan, it was Vienna, it was Warsaw. If you look at 1968, it wasn't simply Paris. Again, it was Chicago, it was Paris, it was Mexico City, it was Bangkok. I mean, and in recent times, one of the events which struck me as very significant, but everybody forgets about, was the events on February the 15th, 2003. When simultaneously, in some 200 cities around the world, there were huge demonstrations against the prospect of a war with Iraq, with something like 3 million people on the streets of Rome, 2 million in Madrid, 1.5 million, maybe 2 million in Barcelona, 1.5 million in Britain. How many that were tried to get in New York, we never know, because Bloomberg said you couldn't march anywhere, and nobody knew who could get out of the subways because everything was jammed. I mean, the urban network is a political institution, and contains a set of political possibilities. And if you look at recent events, we see the uprising in Egypt, of course, which concentrates in Cairo and on Tahrir Square. We see events like Madison, Wisconsin. We see what is going on in Syria right now. Where's the revolt located? It's in cities like Homs and so on. And what we see in Latin America are events like those in Cochabamba, those in El Alto, and those which did not succeed, probably, like Oaxaca. So what we're looking at is a history of tremendous struggles which have had an urban focus. And one of the questions which then follows is the city simply a site where it just happens, the class struggle unfolds? Well, there's some truth to that idea. But nevertheless, the qualities of the city play a very important role in exactly how that revolt unfolds. I mean, one of the big stories about Haussmann in Paris was that he rebuilt the boulevards to try to curb the prospect of another revolution, like what happened in 1848. He was notably unsuccessful in that. But the redesign of many American cities after the urban revolts of the 1960s in this country, which again was many cities involved. The urban design became important because what we in effect found ourselves was highways were neatly engineered to protect the downtown high-value property from potentially restive populations. There were moats constructed, if you like, around the citadels of capital. So there's a sense that the urban has to be controlled, and urban control becomes terribly important on that side, but also that the urban can be used by organizing and mobilizing neighborhoods around kind of collective forms of struggle. And then it seemed to me that when you went back and looked at the most successful histories of factory-based struggles, the best ones nearly always worked because there was very, very strong mobilization in the surrounding communities. And it's very impressive in Argentina. Many of the occupied factories have gone out of their way to turn themselves into neighborhood institutions, cultural institutions, educational institutions, So when the owners come back and try to recuperate the factory or take the machinery or something like that, everybody in the neighborhood turns out and prevents it. So when you have a massive support from the population around and that unity between what's going on in the factory and what's going on in the living space, struggles work much better. But the left has often not been prepared to acknowledge that underlying unity. And so one of the themes I wanted to suggest was we should really be thinking better about how to put all of those elements together in terms of an organized attempt to create an alternative to the kind of capitalist world in which we currently live. And it also turns out that there's a lot of exploitation, of course, that occurs in the living space. I mean, one of the ways in which the bourgeoisie survives is it can concede wage concessions to workers. And then when the workers take their wage packets home, they suddenly find it all disappears because the landlords steal it back, or the merchants steal it back, or today, far more likely to be the credit institutions and the banks and the financiers steal it back. Capital doesn't care where it realizes the surplus value. Does it realize it in the workplace, or does it realize it in the living space? And increasingly, we have an economy of dispossession, which is working in the living space, which is compensating for the fact that they're not managing to make too much in the way of extracting surplus value out of the workspaces. So all of this suggests to me that we should be really thinking seriously about these underlying unities and thinking about the organizational forms that we can build. And out of that comes, I think, a sense that in building those organizational forms, we might want to think about the question of how do you organize a whole city? How do you organize it as a bastion of class struggle? How do you then organize a whole series of cities so they become a network of cities? This actually was how capital broke free of feudalism. Things like the Hanseatic League. Well, imagine if you had a league of socialist cities, what that would look like. Wonderful idea, wonderful image. But we never really think in those terms. And I'm kind of saying, well, we should be thinking and imagining in those terms and working towards the possibility that this is a way to go. The other thing about organizing a whole city is it moves us up a notch in the scale problem. We have a lot of organizational forms right now that look very good from the standpoint of organizing very small scale units. The factory occupations, community organizations, and things of that sort. When you start to think about organizing a whole city, you have to think about organizational forms that are not simply horizontal, but they also have to be vertical, and they have to be, integrated with each other, and we have to think about what's the relationship between politics at different scales within the political system. And so from that standpoint also, it seems to me that we need to think about organizational forms which can actually respond to what seemed to me to be the crucial need right now, which is to find an alternative to the capitalist forms of urbanization. And as I put it in the book, I think our task in some ways is to try to build a socialist city on the ruins of a capitalist urbanization process, which has been highly destructive of social relations, highly destructive environmentally, highly destructive in terms of the possibility of having a genuinely political kind of life, highly destructive of the urban commons, highly destructive of many of the institutional forms that once existed to give some sort of coherence to what the city was or could be about. So those are some of the general themes that I tried to broach at the end there. And it's in that context that I see Occupy Wall Street as beginning to sort of move, as many movements have, through and across urban institutions and urban life, and start to organize so that people are working on the foreclosures, some are working on the student debt. There are many aspects of this all being brought together, and I think the big question for us is, can we package that in such a way to say, this is how we are going to move towards creating an alternative to a capitalist mode of production, which has reached, I think, its end point. Its shelf life is out. And and what we're seeing, I think, is, today I read that formally Europe is now back in recession, Britain is back in recession, and they're saying the double-dip recession has arrived. Well, believe you me, we're going to be in a triple-dip recession very soon, and this is kind of the future that we're facing. So we've really got to start thinking big time about alternatives right now. So with that, let me just turn it over to David and let David sort of talk a little bit about his perspective on some of these things, and particularly his much closer involvement I think with Occupy Wall Street and where that has gone and where it's going.
Okay. Is the microphone working? Can people hear me? Oh, good. Thanks so much for having me here. By the way, I apologize for the silly costume. I actually, it's not totally an act of whimsy. I was actually at an action earlier in Union Square where we were ceremonially destroying a giant loan statement and declaring a biblical jubilee. And the Reverend Billy came out in his preacher outfit, and I had to have something to match it. So I found this old Oddfellows costume that I picked up at a used place in Austin. Got a matching hat, and sort of Roman themes seemed to work. But I had to rush here from there. But yes, I have actually been involved sometimes more deeply, sometimes less, sometimes actually acting, sometimes writing about it since the summer. When we were first trying to put together the occupation at Zuccotti Park. And between activism and constantly having to write, one of the things that I never ever get to do is to read a book. There really isn't any time for it. And I'm really grateful for events like this because I kind of have to read the book, right? If I come to an event like this, so I got to read it, and I'm very excited. I think it's a really wonderful work which throws out all sorts of ideas and challenges that I think we are beginning to think about in practical ways in the movement itself. I mean, as you probably know, the situation of Occupy Wall Street, we had this kind of moment of national effervescence. This is kind of remarkable to me because I was involved in the global justice movement, and I was one of those diehards who was never willing to admit that it was over. We kept on going after 9/11, after 2003 in Miami, the repression got particularly intense. But every year there was another thing where we said to ourselves, "No, this is it. We're back now. We're back now. It's going to be the same thing. Refigurative politics, direct democracy, direct action. It's going to become contagious." And every year we kind of got ourselves convinced it was going to happen, and then it never did. And at some point, I think you really get to the point where you don't even really believe it's going to happen. You're just telling yourself this. Your life is kind of organized around this thing that you don't really believe is actually possible on some level anymore. And then it happened. There we were, and we did this Occupy Wall Street thing, which was something that was kind of handed us by adbusters that threw out this idea, just as I had many times before, incidentally, and just sort of let it drift, because I guess they had this idea that you just put something out on the internet and it kind of happens on the internet, of course, which isn't really true. A lot of people sort of decided we would use this as a sort of excuse more than anything else to create a movement based on principles of direct democracy, general assemblies. And suddenly it took. It just after 3 weeks, I really couldn't believe I have to wake up and pinch myself. And a lot of us had the same experience. Like, there's 500 occupations across America. What happened? Why did it work? And I spent a lot of time thinking about why that is. And it's interesting. I think I'll talk about what happened. Well, I should talk also about what's happened since. As we know, there was a huge outpour. Suddenly the media was actually talking about what was happening, which was shocking. I've been dealing with the American media on and off for 10 years. And I remember the first time I did an interview with Canadian media before Direct Action in Quebec City. And I looked at the piece that came out and I said, oh my God, they wrote down what I actually said. That had never happened to me before in America. The American media is just almost systematically hostile to movements like this. And there was a brief window where they seemed to open up to it. They were even willing to admit to police violence because, Gandhian strategies, which is what we were basically pursuing, where you show that no matter how nonviolent you are, the authorities will react with vicious violence if you challenge certain principles. It's very hard to do that in America. The last people who really did it on a mass scale successfully were the civil rights movement. Because the media just won't report it that way. Media can't report officially sanctioned police behavior as violence, no matter what they do. But suddenly they did. The famous pepper spray incident, the Brooklyn Bridge arrests, there was, and something very interesting happened. On the ground, tactically, we pretty much won. The first eviction from Zuccotti Park, we managed to stop it. Bloomberg had to block down. A month later, something happened, and there was this wave, a coordinated wave of evictions across America, affected through extraordinary brutality. And for one reason or another, the media sort of just dropped the story. We don't know how these things happen, but what it's led to is a real split. I mean, the official narrative is that there were all these dissensions within OWS. And, there was some of that, partly because people were in shock and when you don't have an immediate camp to run. All these tensions that had existed before sort of come out. We went through a couple months of great recrimination, but we bounced out of it. But when we showed up again, we discovered that in fact, in a lot of ways, we'd sunk much deeper roots. Most people don't know things. We have things like Occupy Farms. I think there's 15 occupied farms in New York State now. We have incredible level and diversity of different projects, from Occupy Foreclosed Homes to library projects to medical projects. Anything you can possibly imagine. We really are at work trying to reinvent another society. And it's been deepening and broadening. Actually, our slogan, a little off color, but I've always liked it, seems most appropriate to what happened is a fuck us and we multiply. All over the way, we're having new versions of OWS and new manifestations. Yet, in the spring, as we're reemerging, we're facing an enormous level of repression, which, for some reason, is no longer a news story. So the most critical thing, I think that's happened, that's changed Occupy Wall Street, is there's a slow transformation of class alliances. Liberal organizations and well-meaning liberal people got involved in mass numbers in the original occupations. In fact, a lot of these people didn't even understand that they were joining a group that was founded basically on anarchist principles of direct democracy and direct action, which is fine. But when it came to the inevitable police repression, there has been a kind of a split. I always say that there's a kind of traditional terms of alliance between the liberals and radicals in American social movements, which is essentially that we create, we the radicals, create a fire on your left so that you become relevant again in your various reformist projects. People will listen to them since you seem like the more moderate alternative to us. And so we create a fire to your left to make you relevant, and you keep us out of jail. So basic civil liberties issues. Is what the central role of the larger NGOs and groups like Move On and that got heavily involved ought to be, at least from our perspective. And there's a colossal failure in that regard. Once the violence began in earnest, it was not made into a national issue. Most people are not aware, for example, I'm just going to throw something out. In Egypt, in November, a lot of people heard of this, when they started reoccupying Tahrir Square, security forces' tactics suddenly shifted to a sort of calculated campaign of sexual violence. Not only were they beating people, but they sort of systematically groping women and stripping people. When we started trying our reoccupation of Zuccotti Park on March 17th, and continually since the Union Square occupation, now the occupation on Wall Street itself, suddenly the American police started doing the same thing. We hadn't really had reports of this, any significant reports of this earlier, but suddenly, we have these incidents where they're systematically grabbing women's breasts. And I have a friend with 5 times in one day, 5 different officers. there's a sort of campaign, and not to, a friend of mine, this happened to at Zuccotti Park, and she sort of yelled at the cops, called her pervert, so they took her behind the lines and broke her wrists. I mean, this is the kind of level of violence that we've been talking about right here in the city. And I think that a lot of our former allies are horrified at making a case about this, or even confronting the fact that this is going on, because it tells us something about what kind of society we've really lived in, the degree of militarization and securitization of even everyday life in a city like New York. As a result, a lot of our attention has been placed on issues of police brutality, but as a result also, there's been a shift of alliances, which in a way I think is actually kind of healthy. We are turning much more to alliances with groups that know a lot about this sort of treatment and know how to deal with it. We've been dealing much more with unions, and also especially radical groups within unions, of which there is a burgeoning number of grassroots groups within larger unions that are experimenting with horizontal decision-making and more radical democratic forms. We've been talking a lot with immigrant groups. May Day, which will be happening quite soon, is going to be, in some ways, a repeat of the famous Day Without an Immigrant, May Day mobilizations. Been reframed, among other things, the Day Without the 99%. But we've been working with immigrants groups, but we've also got a lot of unions on board, which is actually a real historical shift in America, because it's going to mark the first time that really large number of American unions are celebrating Labor Day on the day that the rest of the world celebrates it. I think that's symbolically very important. So this is where Occupy Wall Street is at. We're really at a convergent point where there's a deeper turning to communities. We're talking about things like workplace occupations. We're talking about creating community general assemblies and councils. We're experimenting with a broad range of forms of self-organization. And this is exactly the moment, I think, that thinking about theory is really important. And I think David Harvey's book is really helpful here, because one problem we have had, and it's almost inevitable in a way, is that it's like the generals are always fighting the last war. The social theory that becomes identified with a social movement of social mobilization tends to be that drawn from the last round. So that classically in the globalization movement, the ultra-globalization movement of around 2000, 2001, the sort of theoretical works that really got pulled out and were seen as being the sort of embodiment of the movement were Harden Negri's Empire, and autonomous theory that really came out of the 1970s in Italy. At the moment, we're having a resurgence of stuff, in a way, my own writings from around 2000 in some quarters are being developed in the same way for a movement 10 years later. And it might be nice for once in history to actually create theory relevant to this moment rather than the last time around. I think that reconsidering the role of the city is really critical there. We're at a moment in Occupy Wall Street where we're sitting down and we're trying to deepen our own theoretical perspectives. We're actually talking about creating a series of conversations, open conversations about visions, about organizational questions, about the very kind of questions of scale that David raises in the book, and which we haven't had the opportunity, unfortunately, to handle practically, but we'd like to get to the point where we will. Now, it strikes me that one of the most important insights, one thing that I pulled out of this, it really stayed with me as critical, is your discussion of the role of the proletariat and labor and the creation of the city. Because we're really stuck with an old-fashioned paradigm about work, it seems to be. And the composition, class composition, if I can use the term, that we're seeing emerging in Occupy Wall Street is really interesting in that regard. Because here we have a series of cities in largely deindustrialized sections of America, where we still have a working class, but we have class alliances that look really different than anything that we've seen really at any period I'm aware of. If you think about it this way, the TWU, the Transit Workers Union, is one of the strongest allies of the Occupy Wall Street movement. So much so that the TW is actually still suing the New York Police Department for commandeering their buses to take away the people arrested in the Brooklyn Bridge protest. TW has been amazing. But if you think about the occupation from Zuccotti Park, it was the single largest group of people who spearheaded that initial occupation were young people who were either students or recently had been students, saddled with enormous student loan debt. Now, the reason why this is significant is, well, the plight of a group of indebted ex-college students is not the sort of thing that really would have spoken immediately to the heart of transit workers through most of American history. Why is it that right now there's this strong alliance and identification? 10 years ago it would not have been the case. Like 40 years ago it would hardly have been the case. I mean, I still talk to people who are veterans of Wall Street protests in, say, 1970. The late 60s and early 70s, when construction workers would come in with 2x4s and physically attack them. So the class alliances have really profoundly changed here, and we need to understand why and how that's happening. One reason I think it's happening has to do with the nature of capitalism itself and forms of surplus extraction. I think most of us are aware of the phenomenon of financialization of capitalism. At this point, only 16% of corporate profits are derived from industry, and even that's wildly overstated because that includes, for example, the profits of General Motors, which at this point are largely come from their financial division and not from the actual production of cars at all. The vast majority, or the single largest share, comes from finance, but I think something like, is it 30% of profits come from the fire sector at this point, at least? 40 at this point, yeah. And the interesting thing that we don't know is how much of the average American's income is actually directly appropriated in that way. This struck me as profound when I started looking at trying to get the numbers that we can't. I mean, there's no one place where you can find these numbers tabulated. You can get the amount that is paid in loans, you can get the amounts, but it usually doesn't include things like late fees, which often come to 50%, especially with student loans, various fees, penalties, service charges. If you tabulate it all, the closest I could come made it sound like it was about 18%. Well, that's really significant. And especially when you consider that is wildly disproportionately distributed according to class, race, and other demographic factors, income in general. So that, there are people from 40% of their, a lot of families in America, 40% of their income goes to student loans alone. If you look at what happened in 2008, for example, you find that the actual total amount of indebtedness and the amount of people's income that they were paying in loans actually plummeted very, very quickly. It's one of the sharpest drops I've ever seen on any chart, actually. Because everybody who actually could deleverage themselves and get themselves out of debt seemed to be doing so. People with mortgages, people with credit card debt were trying to liquidate it. The two types of debt that people really don't seem to have been able to get out of were precisely student loans, which went up rather sharply during this period, and things like subprime mortgages, and the sort of debts owed by the working poor, who are, of course, inordinately dependent on the incredibly extravagant rates of interest that you get from payday loans and other extremely parasitical, predatory lending. So all of a sudden the working poor and the college student are set in a rather structurally similar position. They're the people who can't pull themselves out of the grip of Wall Street. So a movement that highlights essentially the degree to which our economy has become, the profit base of Wall Street itself has become a sort of system whereby they take money directly from you, redistribute it to politicians who allow them to write the regulations which supposedly regulate the corporations, which then give them the right to take even more money from you. Particularly speaks to both those sections of the population. But I think, it makes us question very nature of what's happening to capitalism itself. And obviously, when I was in college, I learned a very simplistic version of the sort of Perry Anderson version of capitalism versus feudalism, where capitalism extracts their surplus indirectly through the wage, and when you take the surplus through juro-political means, that's called feudalism. I think it's a simplistic thing to say that it's turning into a more feudalistic form of capitalism. Rent-taking has always been an element. But there's been a shift within capitalism, rather remarkably, which explains the changing natures of class alliances, and we need a theory that can take that on. I think that reimagining labor itself is we really do have the shackles of very old-fashioned notions. And I think one of the most wonderful things about the book is how effectively it challenges that. If you think of making the city, what is this productive labor? Labor of production. When we think of labor, we think of production as being the paradigm for labor. But most of the labor that we spend is in maintaining things. A building is a beautiful example. Is it produced? It's produced, it's maintained, it's changed, it's transformed. The paradigms for labor that we use are very much built on examples that Marx used, not because he thought that factory labor was the major form of labor, but because he was taking certain political he's not writing a work of political economy, he's writing a critique of political economy. He's taking certain assumptions from the political economists' of his day, saying, well, even if this is true, we can demonstrate that the system is profoundly contradictory and will ultimately destroy itself. But the problem is we then take that as if that he is presenting to us as the literal truth of what's going on. Labor has always been a much more complex thing. And I think that the social composition of current social movements can only be explained by about a change in the nature of labor that we don't completely understand. And I think that the way that it's largely been taken on theoretically has been coming out of that Italian autonomous tradition, which I think gets it half right. I think that they're profoundly right when they say that much of the capitalism doesn't really create anything. To a large degree, it appropriates the creativity of the working classes, and not just in the way that in factory production, but on every level. I think your example, the creation of urban neighborhoods, is a beautiful example. In a lot of ways, all the best things in modern life are the creations of the working class, but they're creations of the working class when they're not working. Everything from shish kebab stands to rock and roll, are essentially working class creations during the hours they have off. But even more than that, I think that to really understand what's happening, we need to I would say, rather than the sort of rhetoric of immaterial labor biopower, which I don't want to get into, but I think is profoundly problematic, the most useful theoretical way to approach this might be to combine David Harvey's insights into the nature of the city and the production of urban environment with the feminist tradition, which I do think that we need to pay more attention to it, because they've been handling these questions for a lot longer than anyone. And what form of labor do we think of as paradigmatic? To some degree, it's not simply one problem with the framing of these things in Marxist theory is that production is assumed to be the production of material objects, and the production of human beings is sort of sidelined as reproduction, which in a subtle way sort of suggests that it's almost biological in comparison. I've always disliked that phrase, reproduction. I like to think of it rather as the production of human beings. So I think alongside that idea of the production of urban environment, we're also producing each other. Which is, again, a process which cannot actually be reduced to the standard categories of political economy. And I think that it will be necessary, if we have any understanding of what's happening across America, why this movement seems to have coalesced and taken on the breadth and depth that it has, we need to think about that in terms of the confluence between debt extraction and the creation of human beings. I will give an example. I don't know if people are familiar with the We Are the 99% Tumblr page. It's a page where people are invited, it's largely people who are too busy working to actually take part in occupations, to sort of put in their own contribution by taking pictures of themselves with little signs where they tell their life story, their situation. It always ends with I am the 99%. Now, somebody did a word count analysis of the little statements, and some of them are really touching and moving, of the depredations of indebtedness, the problems, almost insuperable problems that ordinary people are facing under the current economy. So he went through the signs, and he did, sort of some computer geek, sort of counted up the words, and he discovered that the word that's used most is jobs. Word number 2 was debt. And so forth and so on, did the top 20 words, and he said, well, the fascinating thing is that nobody here is demanding dignity of work. They're not demanding workplace democracy. They're demanding the means to exist. And he actually went back to a quote that I had taken from Moses Finley. What is that? A quote that I had taken from Moses Finley, that, in the ancient world, there's one revolutionary program, which was essentially cancel the debts and redistribute the land. Which is, he said, the demands of a peasantry, not of an industrial proletariat. They're basically saying, just give us the means for a basic existence. Now, the reason I thought this was interesting is I started looking at it, and I thought, well, yeah, but this shows the kind of limit of this kind of statistical word count analysis, no matter, I'm almost done, no matter how sophisticated, because if you look at the actual signs, there's something really profoundly more going on here, and I want to introduce this. First of all, 80% of the people who contribute to this page are women. And almost all of them, including the men, are involved in what you might call the caring or helping industries. They're in education, they're in medicine, nursing, doctors, they're in social service provision of one kind or another. And the message that I saw over and over again is a justification of that kind of work and a complaint that essentially, if you want to do a kind of work where you're caring for other people, if you want to do a work where you're not simply in it for the money, where you're doing something decent and taking care of other human beings, they will put you so deeply in debt that you can't take care of your own family. I think that's the complaint. And that's the thing which is drawing people together across the board. And to understand what's happening, I think just that kind of a reimagination of what labor is, what production is a necessary starting place to understand the profound revolutionary changes that are happening in America today. So let me throw that at you and see where we go.
Let me just add to that. I mean, one of the organizations that sprang up both nationally and also here in New York City was the Excluded Workers Congress. Now, this strikes me as a great idea. You're talking about workers. It includes the domestic workers, it includes the taxi drivers, it includes all of those workers who actually play a very significant role in supporting urban life, foundational. And yet they can't be organized in traditional unions because, there's no factory gate outside of which you can sort of catch them and get them to sign things. And there are these organizations, and of course it disproportionately involves women, and particularly women of color. And you kind of get a sense of what the conditions under which that population live. I mean, when I came back from Argentina a couple of weeks ago, I came in at Kennedy Airport at 6 o'clock in the morning, and I get on the E train coming in from Jamaica at 6:30 in the morning, and it's packed. It's absolutely packed. And it's packed mainly by women and women of color, looking absolutely exhausted, going into the city to wake it up so that the suits can come in and everything is nice and smooth, and they can, they're either going to take care of the kids or they're going to do, something of this sort. And that's the population when you start to look at distribution of income in New York City. I mean, this recent study was absolutely astonishing. That there's 1 million people in New York City trying to live on $10,000 a year. Half of the population of New York City is trying to get by on $30,000 a year. And they have no right to the city at all. They have no right to anything. And yet they are the labor, in many instances, they are the labor force which actually supports daily life in the city. And the calculation is that the 1% actually earns in one day that $10,000, which some people are surviving on. These class disparities, which have grown hugely. And this is one of the great success stories, I think, that occupied Wall Street watching it from far away. So it changed the conversation about social inequality. So now there is some attempt, it seems to me, by the Democratic Party at least to take that up, and I don't have any faith in it. I know you don't either, but they're trying. At least they're trying to co-opt a little bit of that, and thank God we're now talking about social inequality rather than talking about
the terrible
austerity and the debt. I mean, at least it's changed the conversation. And I was amused. In the newspaper this morning, there was some item. Either Obama is proposing a law or is signing a law that says that people should not trade with any government which suppresses dissent. New York City, you're in a really rough time. You're going to have a really rough time very soon. I mean, these are the kinds of things that it seems to me you really have to build upon the ludicrous hypocrisies that are in the conversation right now. But just going back to something, the May Day thing is being done partly in collaboration, I guess, with the immigrant rights thing. One of the significant urban events was back in 2006 when the immigrant rights stuff really started big time. There was this proposal in Congress, if you recall, to actually turn illegal immigrants into felons. And that set the immigrant populations off, and the immigrant populations decided they were not going to go to work on several days in that year. And during those days, essentially, Los Angeles closed down, Chicago closed down. There was serious. This is a tremendous power. Now, if you say the proletariat is everybody who produces the city and reproduces the city, one of the things that, if we want to be theoretical about it, Marx says anybody who transports anything is productive of value and all this kind of stuff. So all of those vans that are going around New York City delivering things and fresh, they're actually part of value-producing labor. They are part of a proletariat. Now, transport workers' strikes are actually pretty effective. The French used it several times over the last few years. And of course, it was used negatively in Chile way back in 1973. So if you stop a city functioning, this is a tremendous power. And this is what happened in one of the examples I use in the book, which is El Alto, which actually stopped the flow of goods into La Paz and brought down 2 presidents in the space of about 2-3 years and paved the way for Morales to be elected. Now, Morales has kind of compromised in all sorts of ways with the neoliberal project. We know that. But on the other hand, this was a revolutionary moment when actually the organization of a whole city actually had a tremendous kind of impact. But stopping a city moving. Now, in that sense, I always go back. I arrived in this city just shortly after 9/11, and one of the things that struck me was what happens when a city stops moving. And small wonder, about 3 days into it, Giuliani comes on and says, start shopping, go out, get moving. I mean, you can't, because capital is about continuous flow. It's got to be in motion. If you stop the motion, you've really stopped the whole system. And you see fortuitous events that tell you the same thing. I mean, the cost when those Icelandic volcanoes erupted, and suddenly you couldn't fly across the Atlantic. So you've got to think of the city strategically as a space in which you can act and do things which will potentially be disruptive to the flows of capital and transform, if you like, the metabolic relations of the city. Now, if you take that path, of course, you're going to hit police repression and you're going to hit a police riot, but then a police riot doesn't necessarily clear the city either. It can also close it down. So there's a lot of power which resides, it seems to me, in thinking about the urban as a place to organize, and as a place to come back together. And I think you're dead right about, for example, my impression is that there are quite a lot of segments of the union movement right now that are prepared to change, I think, their stance. Since the publication of this book, I've been approached by some segments of the TUC in Britain saying, we just looked at your book, we want to talk about it. And actually the trades councils in Britain, which were sort of geographically specified, had a much stronger sense of organizing a proletariat than the sectoral unions did. The sectoral unions typically said, we're going to look after the mine workers, we're going to look after the metal workers, and we don't care about anybody else. But if you're a trades council and you're looking after all of the workers in Oxford or all of the workers, then actually you start to say, well, what is the proletarian condition? And you start to be concerned about conditions of life and housing and the sewage and the sanitation and all those other things that actually affect things. And of course the labor councils in this country really have traditionally been regarded as rather secondary instruments within the labor movement, but I think there's a stronger sense now with some elements within the labor movement, Bill Fletcher and other people like that, sort of arguing, well, we should be really. Bill Fletcher was the one who posed to me the question, how do you organize the whole city? And I said, Bill, I have the faintest idea how, but this is something we clearly should be thinking about, and we have to think about it in this new way. So that to me seems to me to be, just to reiterate some of the arguments that occur within it. But I would like to backtrack just a little bit to say that the other theme in the book is to realize how significant urbanization is in the history of capital accumulation. There's this wonderful statement that came out of the San Francisco Reserve Bank that says America gets out of crises by building houses and filling them with things. And actually, since the 1930s, that's what they've done. Actually, you look at the data since the 1930s, that ineffectively is how the United States has been stabilized. For the first time, housing construction went below the 1 million, way down, back to 1940s levels in 2009. And again, it's an end of an era where you can get out of crises by building houses and filling with them things. We cannot do that in this country at this time. It's impossible. There are so many surplus houses around. You can't do it. So recognizing the importance of the urbanization to capital accumulation, what we see is a certain blockage to getting out of the crisis through an urbanization project. The one part of the world that is doing that big time is China. Mm-hmm. And they're booming at 10% because they're building cities at a crazy kind of rate. But again, there's a great deal of protest being organized around that. So I'm kind of very hopeful about some of this, but I'm still bothered somewhat by the scale question. So I wonder, David, if I could ask you to talk a little bit more about how you think this kind of question of organizing at different scales might be approached as a conversation. What would be the talking points? I'm not asking you for a solution. I'm just sort of.
Just before you begin, maybe if people could, with questions, could pass their cards down to the end, and we'll begin to collect them and collate them.
Well, yeah. I mean, essentially, on the question of scale, I think that when you talk about horizontality and hierarchy, we're talking about issues which everybody has to grapple with on some level. And I think you're right that there has been a reluctance to talk about some aspects of that in realistic terms, partly because people want to take a principled position, and if they aren't faced with an immediate problem which will cause them to recognize that some of those principles will have to be at least moderated in practice or become more complex in their application, well, why think about it if you don't have to? So I am actually an avid devotee of the notion of horizontality, but I see horizontality, it's a little bit like the way that someone like Noam Chomsky talks about anarchism as being anti-authoritarian. He says that it's not like there is no possible form of authority that will ever be legitimate. For example, I see the authority of a teacher as being something that will always exist to some degree or another in any society.
Now you've become a teacher, you said.
Well, yes, but I thought that even when I wasn't. I liked my teachers, but maybe that's why I became one. Yeah. But it's because, you know, authority of a teacher is essentially self-destructive authority, right? If you teach well enough, you no longer have the authority because they know everything you used to know. Now, however you frame it, though, I mean, Chomsky's point, I think, and others have said the same thing, is that it's not being anti-authoritarian doesn't mean you say all forms of authority are necessarily always going to be legitimate. You say you start from the assumption that they're legitimate unless they prove to you otherwise. So I think it's really important to maintain that principle of horizontality in the sense that all relations should be horizontal unless there is an absolute proof that you need to have some sort of less horizontal organization. And the word vertical is a little ambiguous here, and the word hierarchy is a little ambiguous here, and part of the problem, I think, really does come down to language. The word hierarchy can be used, and often is used, in two different ways which we conflate. One of which is the notion of taxonomic hierarchies, nested hierarchies, as we talk about in the book. And it is certainly true that once you go up onto any sort of larger scale than a local face-to-face community, you're going to have a notion of levels of inclusion, and, which, you know, are a form of hierarchy in one sense of the term. But what anti-authoritarians object to is not the notion of nested hierarchies in that sense. What they object to is the idea of linear hierarchies, so not hierarchies of inclusion, but hierarchies of exclusion. But what happens is that over and over again, hierarchies of inclusion become the basis for hierarchies of exclusion. So you have more and more inclusive levels, but those people who become the representatives of those more and more inclusive levels become exclusionary groups, which are thus become sort of set apart from the people that they represent. The question, of course, is how to make sure that doesn't happen. And historically, there are approaches that have been used. I actually think that we haven't really examined history closely enough to think about the ways that it can be done. There are people such as in El Alto, Zapatistas, with the notion of recallable delegates. This is rotation approaches that have been experimented with. I think there's a lot more things that we would probably want to think about. One thing that really struck me recently, the other book I read recently, was a book by a French political theorist named Bernard Manin, who wrote a history of representative democracy, who pointed out that the notion of elections through most of Western history were not considered the democratic mode of selecting leaders. It was considered the aristocratic mode of selecting leaders. Because, you know, election is between people who consider themselves the best, and then you choose which one is best of all. The democratic mode of selection was lottery. Basically jury duty, except it's voluntary. You don't have to sign up. You throw your name in the hat, they give you a basic competence test, and then they just choose the name. And Athens actually did that. Florence, other democratic systems have operated quite successfully with this for hundreds of years. So there's a lot of different ways you could organize these things which would prevent the obvious problems of linear hierarchies emerging. I think we haven't begun to explore that, so I don't think that's so much a problem. What I think a problem is how to get there in terms of, I mean, we both take this on, you know, if you haven't destroyed the overarching capitalist world system, any enclave is going to be inherently compromised. The real question is one of how to organize a dual power situation. Once you've achieved autonomy, how not to have it immediately compromised by having to exist and, you know, have access to basic resources within a system which is essentially rigged against it. There are a lot of different ideas about this, but in my recent book, which hasn't come out yet, I actually map out 4 different possibilities. And this is really a way of getting to start thinking about the question, but it might be useful. I call them the Sadr City approach to dual power, the San Andres Accords approach, the El Alto approach, and the Argentine approach. So if you are creating prefigurative institutions, alternatives, whether on a local level or an urban level, whatever level it may be, how do you relate to the larger power structures? Well, what we saw, actually groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Sadrists in Iraq. Actually, a very interesting approach to dual power. It's not as often explored as such as I think it should be. So the Sadrists did, for example, they knew that if you're going to create alternative institutions, what you have to do is you have to start with something that no one could possibly object to. Something so obviously benevolent that no one could complain about it, and then build an army to protect it. So what they did was they started with free clinics for pregnant and nursing mothers. Pregnant women and nursing mothers. Who could possibly object to that? And then they built a militia system to protect it, and sort of gradually created an infrastructure where they came to dominate urban neighborhoods. The problem is how you then relate to the larger national system. And gradually, almost inevitably, they got drawn into local politics and then into national politics. This happened in the Middle East, wherever these sort of right-wing populists did that. So this seems to be a pitfall. Not the direction I think we would want to take, but we want to throw that as the first one. The second one was the Zapatista approach, which I thought was actually quite interesting. The San Andres Accords, they had a brief week, basically 10-day insurrection, quickly said, okay, we're going to negotiate. They had these autonomous self-governing communities. And what they essentially did was they had a prolonged negotiation with the government, even though they knew the government was negotiating in bad faith and would never enforce the treaty, simply because the process of negotiation allowed them a space in which to develop their own autonomy, and an excuse to have democratic consultancies and actually to build up their democratic structure. I'm not sure what an equivalent of that would be for Occupy Wall Street, perhaps some sort of constitutional amendment, or using some sort of process where we don't have to endorse candidates. The El Alto approach, I think, is more sophisticated, but we'd have to get there. And what's really interesting, if you read the writings of not Morales so much as his vice president, he writes quite explicitly that this is an experiment in dual power. What they're trying to do, they have groups like El Alto, which are self-organized communities. And on top of that, they have a political party which they've placed in power, but could just as easily remove. Because what you do is you basically change the terms of engagement with the state, where these self-organized communities have the power and the legitimacy to use forms of direct action to overthrow governments if they have to, essentially stage insurrections. And then you say, all right, we've got our guy in there, and we know there's structural constraints on anybody with government. They'd have to make all these compromises with the world system, with the local bureaucracy, which is not set up to be democratic. But that's okay, because we can kick them out of power at any time. And you make sure that they know that, you make sure that everyone knows that, and that in itself gives a certain power to Evo Morales to stand up to the authorities, because you can say, well, look, my constituencies could kick me out at any time. Of course, in order to get there, and this is what I say to Occupy Wall Street people, we can enter the political process, but only once we've changed the terms of engagement where insurrection is legitimate in America, then it'll be okay. The fourth approach, which I think is what we're doing now as a default, is the Argentine model, which was successful in its own way, which is utter delegitimation. I mean, the one ace in the hole we have is that most people don't consider the government particularly legitimate anyway. If I remember the statistics I was seeing the other day, a larger percentage of Americans would like to see the US become a Soviet communist system than approve of Congress. It's that, which is actually shows that, interestingly, that 10% of Americans actually would accept a Soviet communist system, but 9% approve of Congress. So, most people hate politicians and think they're corrupt anyway. So the Argentine model was essentially, you have your insurrection, you overthrow the government, you create alternative institutions. The famous slogan was que se vayan todos, so they can all go to hell, roughly translated. And it got to the point where politicians basically couldn't go to restaurants. This is your aim, without having to wear phony mustaches and things like that, because people would throw food at them. So once you get to the point where the entire political class is delegitimated, they have to do something. And what Argentina did, and we all know, they defaulted on their debt. And Nestor Kirchner was not the sort of person, incredibly moderate social democrat, comes into power at a point where the entire political apparatus has been utterly delegitimated. He kind of has to do something radical. We could create a situation like that. It's probably the most practical thing we could do with the balance of forces existing as they are in America, but it's kind of the default strategy. And I think the other models provide interesting possible directions of how we could work from there. So let's start with that.
Yeah.
All right, so we have a bunch of questions. Actually, I have a question first. Where exactly where do the suburbs figure into this? I mean, America is mostly suburbs.
Well, that's part of the ruinous capitalist urbanization that I talk about. And, you know, while the right to the city is a good slogan, the right to the suburbs, yuck.
The suburbs, yeah.
But it's you know, I mean, this is part of the I mean, when we're talking about the right to the city in particular, there's a real question as to where does the city begin and end. You have the suburbs, you have the peri-urban stuff, and there's a complicated thing to talk about.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I have a whole pile of questions. We'll try to get through as many of them as possible. So here's the first one. Given that immigrants are, one, an important section of the labor force, and two, that they're largely undocumented, therefore not organized as unions, what kind of role can they play, or have they played in movements like Occupy Wall Street?
Well, it's, you.
Well, I don't think, I mean, you talk about Occupy
I've already talked about it a little bit, yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, I think what happened in those immigrant rights marches back in 2006 was a lot of the undocumented didn't go to work. And a lot of businesses had to close down for the day, you know. So, and actually what's so interesting right now, you know, you see reports from what's going on in California and a lot of the agricultural parts. They can't get the labor right now to pick the fruit, and in fact, businesses are really suffering from the fact that this tightening of the immigration laws is actually creating all kinds of disruptions to capital accumulation, which is very curious side effects. So I think they have a lot of potential power, but of course it's very difficult to exercise. And that's where I think the leadership of the legal migrants becomes absolutely crucial to sort of providing an umbrella situation under which many of the illegals can participate in some way.
Can independent political parties play any valuable role in freeing people from onerous debt, rent, etc.?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I'd like to see them try. I'm an anarchist. I don't do this myself. But the American political system is rigged to make it as difficult as possible for that to happen. But there are things that can happen on a local level, I think, that can't happen on the national level, which I think we should think about. Yes, I had the somewhat uncomfortable position earlier today when I'm wearing this silly costume that they trundled me out at the last moment with the Green candidate for president. And I was like, oh, great. And there goes my anarchist creds. I know no one told me about this. We got kind of ripped up a check together. But I think that political parties serve a propaganda purpose more than anything else. Because it's almost impossible for political parties to actually gain national traction. The entire system is built up in such a way that it, we have to remember that the political structure that we have is a structure that was created to prevent democracy. This is what people don't remember. That I always like to annoy people by pointing out that nowhere in the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution does it say anything about America being a democracy. People who wrote those documents hated democracy. They were utterly against it. In fact, I remember seeing a quote from John Adams, who was very explicit: majority vote? We can't have a majority vote. The first thing they'll do is they'll abolish the debts and redistribute the land. You read a lot of classics. So they set up this system to, basically prevent democracy. And then in the 1830s, they renamed it democracy because people got elected on that platform. And so suddenly everybody was a Democrat. But it's a system that's really designed to make it as difficult as possible for democratic voices to actually work through the system, even before it became a system of pure institutionalized bribery.
So here's a question about organizational forms. So you mentioned Murray Bookchin in your book, in Rebel Cities. What do you think about his notion of confederated general assemblies or popular assemblies as a way of, as creating a form of dual power?
Yeah, I'm in your position. I suppose I'm known as a Marxist, but as a geographer, the tradition is anarchist. I mean, Elise Reclus, Kropotkin were all geographers, and of course, they had great influence on many of the urbanists like Patrick Geddes and then Lewis Mumford and so on. So a lot of thinking about cities from a radical perspective has come out of the anarchist tradition. So I have a lot of admiration for some of the works of Murray Bookchin, because he takes on some of these questions. I also have some criticisms, and so I often feel I'm in dialogue with him, because I think, as I recall it, and you probably tell me if I get this wrong, the federated assemblies are supposed to be really about, this is a Saint-Simonian notion, they're supposed to be about the government of things, not of people. And that seems to me to be a very difficult divide to maintain, particularly when you get into the question of the global commons and how they can be managed. If there are problems in the global commons, and we see that in something like global warming, then there are things that may need to be done which do actually intervene in the way in which people behave and have impacts on how people behave. I mean, that's where you get into this kind of question: is it all from the bottom up, or is it going? What's the balance between the power relations? And I once wrote a utopian sketch called Idyllia, which was sort of an appendix to Spaces of Hope. And one of the points I made was that you probably need to have global commissions, at least to inform the population as to what the nature of the global problems might be, because I don't think that anybody sitting in any particular commune somewhere would necessarily be aware of, say, a global process like ozone hole or depletion of biodiversity or those kinds of aggregate things. So there has to be some way of creating an information source that at least then poses these problems to action at the local level, which would then have considerable influence, I think, over the actions at the local level, and then what to do if no action is taken at the local level, because, as we often know, if you ask everybody to economize in some way or other, then you do get a common issue, which is, I decide, oh well, I won't bother, let everybody else do it. And of course, if everybody decides that, then you get no action. So if every commune decided, for example, that, well, it understood the nature of the problem, but everybody else was going to work on it, so that was all right. So there are issues of that kind which would come up, and they need to be thought about.
Yeah, I mean, there's a question of technical expertise is often left out of this. And again, it's harder in that case to go back to the past because they had options available to them that we don't anymore. For example, in ancient Athens, all the sort of technical, the engineers or the technical roles that you needed to have permanent people, they just got slaves. So, there was no chance of their really taking on autonomous power, but we can't really do that. I think that the thing about Bookchin that I would add is that Bookchin tended to dichotomize unduly. And one problem with his work is that he has this tendency over and over again, if there's a sort of subtle problem, what to do with lifestyle anarchism versus social anarchism, how do you square personal liberation with ultimate social liberation, he'd just say, well, one is completely good and the other is completely bad. Social anarchism is great, lifestyle anarchism sucks, this has nothing to do with it. And he did the same thing with direct democracy and worker control. And I think this is what key flaw in his vision is that, he says, all right, there's a subtle question that we all have to handle in any sort of democratized society, which is how do you square the problem, one principle which says all those people engaged in a project should have say over how that project is done. And the second principle, which is all those people affected by a project should have some say in how that project is done. Now, one of them, if you take it exclusively, leads to pure workers' control. The other leads to a sort of general direct democracy on every level. Well, clearly, some compromise between the two principles has to be worked out. And it just seems reasonable. If there's a factory, then people in the surrounding community really don't care about their vacation policy, but will probably want to have some say over what they dump in the river. That only makes sense. Bookchin kind of goes just one way, says, no, worker control is totally wrong, get rid of it. Only direct democracy. So there's an inherent flaw in the system which allows him to kind of create a purism which would never actually exist if people started really doing this. So I think that what we would end up is a system of much more heterogeneous than anything that these sort of abstract theorists envision. A lot of the problems that will arise when we have like contrasting principles and have to square them in some reasonable fashion are ones we can't even probably imagine right now. But so these are really thought experiments, sort of like Paracon more than anything else.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, he said all Marxists are all wrong as well. So
yeah,
but he was actually he was very nice and actually extremely respectful to me a couple of times I met him, which was kind of a little surprising. I was expecting to walk in the room and him say, "Listen, Marxist," but he didn't do it. I was quite surprised.
All right, so a point of agreement between you two seems to be that stopping the flows on which capitalism is dependent is a goal strategy for creating and asserting popular power. What are the flows around which organization or of putting on the brakes is even possible today? Oh, help. That's what it ends with.
Help. Oh, okay.
Help.
Well, where do we start? You want to take that or shall I?
Well, you start.
All right. I mean, while you were talking about the right to the city, you know Seth Bachman, the cartoonist, he has this wonderful poster he often does for us, which has a picture of sort of tall building that turns into a raised fist at the end. And the slogan is, "We made the city, we can shut it down." And I think that, there's layer on layer where it's possible to do this, but the entire part of the big problem is that another element of work that we haven't talked about is security work. I mean, we have insane percentages of our population doing what economists sometimes call guard labor, depending on how you define, which is supervising, providing security for, everyone from doormen and night watchmen to police to spies to supervisors at work. It's a little like during the Civil War, I believe for every 3 soldiers there was like 1 guy to shoot them if they ran away. We have a very similar situation in capitalism today. I think it's something like 20%, and the percentage of people involved in guard labor, surprisingly enough, goes up the higher the degree of social inequality in the society. So a country like Denmark has the lowest level of guard labor. America has one of the highest in the world. Which is one of the problems that, a very large percentage of the proletariat are employed to physically threaten the rest of the proletariat, or those people who make the city. There's a limited number of things there are things that people can do, because there is a degree to which, if you are working especially within the grounds of labor, organizing, there's a kind of a sympathy that you can get that you won't get otherwise. I've noticed this rather dramatically myself in the case of sabotage and direct action. Police, I'm part of the IWW, and we've done actions where we've done pickets where, it's a bunch of black bloc kids who are exactly the same guys who might be like breaking a window in Oakland, dressed exactly the same with red and black banners, but they're IWW and they're picketing. And suddenly, we're sabotaging trucks and the cops are kind of looking the other way and, letting us get away with murder, which, they would just immediately beat us up and put us in jail if the same people had been doing that in a different context. So I think ultimately there is a way to appeal, on small levels that way. And we have to remember that at some point, when we win, it's because they refuse to shoot at us. The security forces will have to choose sides at some point. And that's going to be a key juncture. Before that, I think that we need to think very hard about how to operate within the confines of such a system. I think the breakdown will happen largely because I actually honestly believe that capitalism can't really afford the degree of guard labor and securitization that it's created. I think one of the big problems is they put all of their weapons in this incredible level of militarization, securitization, and propaganda. to the degree that they've created a system whereby anybody thinks that challenging the system in any way and blocking the flows is inherently impossible. Direct action is impossible. Alternatives to capital is impossible. The cost of doing that is so high that it's actually destroying capitalism. I'm personally convinced of this. So the one thing that they've achieved is that none of us think that there's anything else is possible and there's anything we can do about it. Now we're watching the whole thing dissolve in front of us, and the one victory they've had is that we're all sitting here dumbfounded without any idea what we can do.
You know, I often think about how successful bin Laden was. You know, the flows through airports these days are it's very expensive, tremendous cost. Homeland security now costs an immense amount, and we're talking about direct and indirect costs, which have been visited on the American people and actually globally through having to sort of secure the flows from interruption. But there are other things I would think about. I mean, for example, when you think about the city as the metabolism of the city, one of the ways in which El Alto succeeded was it cut off the food supply into La Paz, and the bourgeoisie basically lives in La Paz, and the El Alto folk live up on the plateau, and they cut the food supply. So the bourgeoisie had to live on canned beans and things like that, and this was very effective. So I think that if you imagine a very sophisticated labor organization right back down the food chain, from the supermarkets right back into the farms, and that is well organized, and I think actually there are elements in the IWW that are trying to organize that.
Absolutely, that's our idea.
That whole food chain. Then you would have considerable power. And I'm not talking about just blocking the whole thing and then sort of saying, well, okay, let everybody starve, because we would starve too, and that's not the idea. The idea is to have a certain power over a flow, in relationship to a flow, in which you can exert that power and use it. For example, a lot of the people involved in that food chain are illegal immigrant workers and so on. But
Most of them, yeah.
Use that power in that chain to gain significant benefits for that population. At the same time as you use that power and you try to, you then always have to sort of go to the final consumer and say, do you realize the labor conditions that exist right the way through here? So if there's some disruption and you cannot get your favorite vegetables because we're cutting off the food supply, then sympathize with it. And actually, it's often not hard to develop that. I mean, I think one of the things that was key in the French transportation strikes was that the majority of the population sympathized very much with the strikers. Mm. And even though they were inconvenienced and they had to, I don't know, walk or bicycle or find some other way of getting to work or not go to work or whatever, there was still considerable sympathy there. And I think the same thing has taken place in Chile with the student strike there. That the recent polls, I was in Chile for 1 week, but I wasn't there also about it. About 70% of the Chilean population actually supports what the students are asking. Mm. And this is, and I think President's popularity rating is now about 20%, so it tells you this is having a terrific political impact upon the political situation. And that, of course, is again a strike of occupation for a year or more in high schools and all of the public universities, and there's very solidarity and very, very sophisticated piece of action. So what's being looked for here are ways to organize and mobilize so that you have some power by saying, if we withdraw our labor, if we cut the supply, then this can be extremely disruptive, and capitalism is extremely vulnerable, it seems to me, to any disruption of the flows. And so that therefore we should think about strategies to try to get power in relationship to those flows, not necessarily to just cut them off and then kind of say, well, we're going to walk away from it by, you know, I don't know, putting down the electric grid or something like that and then walking away, because that would be awful for everybody and you probably wouldn't get any public support out of doing that kind of thing. But you know, find ways to think about it. So there are lots of, when you think about the metabolic condition of a city, then you can see lots of ways in which you can start to organize around that metabolism.
It's also critical to have the potential to do things. It doesn't mean you have to actually do it.
Right.
I mean, for example, and this is a weird case I learned recently, one reason why the Zuccotti Park occupation was successful, why they decided not to kick us out right away, was I know a Rolling Stone reporter who talked to a lot of the police officials and other city officials, was all those guys in the Guy Fawkes masks. They were convinced that you know, if they did evict, Anonymous would like hack their credit card accounts. You know, just having any kind of plausible threat like that will change their behavior.
All right, so I'm afraid we're out of time. So this one final question. This isn't really a question. David Graeber mentioned Occupy Farms. Occupy Farms needs a van. If you have a van we can use, please email occupy-farms@googlegroups.com.
Very important. This is great work they're doing.
So if you have a van, please email them.
Yeah.
Thank you to all of you for joining us. Please check us out at the Haymarket book table. Are you guys signing books?
Yeah, we'll sign some books.
Yeah, they'll be signing books at the table.